How do you know you're at a 12 valve meet? Every truck is leaking fucking oil. Okay, today we're going to put the crank in Mike's 12 valve, but it is important we talk about bearing clearances.
Bro, nobody cares about that. Let's just get to the stacks and the 410 bumpers.
You shut up. This is important. Why? I'll tell you. Also, as a disclaimer, for pretty much the span of this channel, it's called 6BT Academy. We're here to teach. I'm trying to find kids to put this down and pick up one of these. That's what we're trying to do. So, I know.
Oh, we know this already. Why you gotta be so boring?
Maybe you know it. Why are you on YouTube? You want to figure it out. So that's what I'm here to do. Bear with me. I know it gets monotonous, but I'm trying not to skip stuff that some people may not know. Anyway, back to bearing clearance. For this segment, we are going to focus on the crank, but this goes for everything. But I'm just going to use terms for the crank to get through this, okay? What is bearing clearance? Bearing clearance is going to be the space between your main bearing and your main bearing journal of the crankshaft.
So, like, why do we need it?
You need it for two reasons. Number A, thermal expansion. 2, oil flow. When we go out there, I'll show you how the crank gets its oil, what it does with it. It'll make much more sense. Now, for the Cummins crank, we're looking at a spec between 2 and 6 thousandths. Once again, I'll show you how to find that when we go outside. Throughout this, you'll hear me rifle off specs and torques and blah, 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 blah. I have the Bibles because I'm a tool bag. Do you have to buy these? No. Should you? Probably. But all I'm saying is I know Google is amazing and has all the answers. You don't have to do any thinking. Be careful. Stay off the forums. And just use your head. Now, why am I putting so much emphasis on this? Story time. The 12 valve ISB was used in... They were used in buses, ambulance, fire trucks, generators, excavators, skid steers.
8 hours later.
Tugboats, cruise ships, yachts, you name it. It's been in everything and absolutely worked to death.
So what does that matter?
It matters because when you get it for your swap, there's a reason it's sitting on a pallet. If this works, I'm not going to change the batteries, right? As always, there's going to be exceptions. But when you go on buy, sell, trade, eBay, Craigslist, whatever, and you buy a Cummins engine, it's going to belong in two camps. Needs refreshed or has been refreshed. And that's okay. It's fine. There's things you need to look for, unless you buy a perfectly running driving truck and rip it apart, but it would take a complete idiot to do that. You heard me say in the last video, the engine we're dealing with for Mike is all standard. Never been machined, never been punched out. Now, when you take yours apart, it's easy to tell. When you pull your main cap off, you will look at your bearing, it'll be stamped. You can't see it, hold on. It'll be stamped STD standard. So when you go to buy bearings, you're gonna look for that STD, standard, stock, you're good. So, what happens when you see this?
My dad won't answer the phone. I don't know.
If you have a main journal that is damaged, scored, grooved, whatever it may be, a machine shop can grind it smooth again. It'll take off 10 thou, 20 thou, whatever is needed. When you do that, you are ultimately making that journal smaller. So what you have to do is buy what they call a undersized bearing that has a little more bearing material to it that'll pretty much just take up the room that you removed. In recap, what I'm trying to say is when you get your donor engine, if you're unsure, tear it apart. Do not buy anything until it's in your hand, because these are not cheap. If you buy these and they're the wrong size, especially if they're OEM Cummins, most people won't take them back. Make sure you know what you have. Order the right things the first time. Enough of me talking. Let's go put a crank in. One more thing I deem to be important. When you tear an engine down, you never ever lay a crank or a cam on its side. It's if you're doing it for 10 seconds, sure. If you're storing it, always store your cranks and cams upright. Because if you lean them like this against the lobes, they tend to bend and tweak, and you don't want that. Store them upright. All right. Described in the house, your oil pump will sit here. It'll make more sense when the front cover's on, and it'll pump to the oil galleys of the engine. So your crank is going to get its oil from these holes through the oil galleys of the motor, and then this would be your piston squirter that hits the skirt of the piston. So when you open your box, you're going to have two sets of bearings, tops and then the block side. You'll see a block side because of the hole. Pretty self-forward. Now you see this big guy with the thrust washer on it. I'll describe what that means, the one that's in the truck. If you look at the journal between 5 and 6, you'll see how it's got this extra machining cutout. That's for that thrust washer. You want to lubricate this surface, not this surface, but the inside, with a good assembly lube. I will be using Lucas. Permatex Ultra Slick's good. The book calls for 1540 motor oil. White lithium grease has been used for 100 years. Okay, our lowers are in. You'll notice that the oil squirter hole are all half off like that. That's the way it's supposed to be. I don't have an answer why. Don't freak out. We're going to put assembly lube on these. You do not want to touch bearings with your bare hands. Do the best you can. Keep your fingers off of it. And we'll get these lubed up. Cranked before we set it in. Clean it to the best of your abilities. The cleaner the better. Be careful with these things. They are heavy. I mean, what are they? Ronnie, how heavy are these things?
Yeah, buddy. Wait.
He don't know. Crank is in. We're going to put our bearings on our main caps. Like any other engine, when you pull your main caps, you should always put them in the order you took them out, front to back. Luckily for you guys, Cummins is good people, and they're stamped 1 through 7. So we'll change the bearings out, get them in, finger tight the bolts. Notice in your cap, this little indent. Your bearing has that too, so only go in one way. That's all there is to it. Let's do it. Okay, you saw me tap on the caps with a rubber mallet. These caps have these alignment dowels in them. We're just trying to seat the alignment dowels. Don't go smashing on them, just make sure they're seated. going over the light if you don't feel comfortable. Now we're going to torque. Fancy Cummins Bible says 4 steps to torque this crank. We're going to do a preliminary of 37 foot-pounds. Look it over, make sure everything's seated and everything spins and happy. If we're good there, we're going to go 44 foot-pounds, 66 foot-pounds, and then the last step should be 90 degrees. The next part of this is very important because it will follow you for the entire span of this engine assembly. We are going to torque this in an X pattern. We're going to start with this middle bearing and work from the center outward. Everything you do to this engine, from the crank to the head to the exhaust manifold to even the oil pan, you're going to work from the inside out in an X pattern. So when you tighten these bolts in sequence, it's going to go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and so on and so forth. And like I said, go through, make sure everything is nice and square. And then what I did, I took my little chintzy 4BT damper here and just make sure you turn. What you're going to do now when we start the torquing process is every cap you torque, you want to spin this. What that will allow, if you torque this one and spun it, and then you hit this one and it stops, you know this is your problem. So let's go to 44 foot-pounds. Okay, so the final pass here is calling for a 90-degree torque. This particular torque wrench can do degrees on its own, but if you were doing it with a click style, or even you can do this with a breaker bar, a couple ways you can do it. Obviously, you could just set up your breaker bar and turn it at 90 degrees. That's fine. If for some reason you're not on a stand or it's hard to get a full 90-degree swing, what you can do is take a paint marker and use the flats of the bolt. Have a reference point. You know, say you want to go 90 degrees, you would put a paint line here and you would turn it until that hits your reference point. Make sense? 90 degrees, let's get this done. All right, last thing. Why are we here? We need to check our clearances. I'm confident because my motor was a standard bore, low miles. I was happy. I'm going to check anyway because I'm using aftermarket bearings. Should I use Cummins bearings? Yeah. Why aren't I? Well, so what you do is go to Grandpa's toolbox and you'll find something that looks like this. It's called plastic gauge. It's just a little piece, I'll show you in a minute, a little piece of plastic you're going to put in your main cap, torque it, and it's going to smash it down. And then you'll compare it to the reading. It'll tell you your clearance. It'll make more sense when I do it. Set our plastic gauge on there. Put your cap back on. 37, 44, 66, 90 degrees. Ready? As you recall, our spec was 2 to 6 thousandths. And if you look, we're right around that 3 to 4. So, right where we need to be. That's it. Your crank's in. I know that ran a little long, but it's a pandemic. It's 10 degrees outside. Speaking of which, I'm cold. Do yourself a favor, go build something today. Do me a favor, and do it for the old man. We'll catch you next time.